Since the invention of the atomic bomb, the ways of war have changed drastically. For countries to stay at the top of their game, they need to have protocols in place to protect themselves. That's what America's president is doing. He has banned microchips to curb China's AI weapon production. After the CHIPS Act was passed in July, which gave $52 billion in subsidies and tax breaks to companies that make semiconductors in the country, the current president of the US said in a super proud way that manufacturing in the country is back on its A game. In 2026, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company will start making 3-nanometer chips in Arizona. These chips will be the most advanced microelectronics in the world. This is in addition to the 20,000 5-nanometer chips per month that TSMC planned to make in 2019. East Asia is where most semiconductors are made, and as tensions between China and the US are getting worse, this is a new push to make the country less dependent on the region. East Asia gives them important microelectronics that are used to make conventional weapons and important artificial intelligence algorithms that are used to make new weapons. But what Biden didn't want to talk about was the equally important work the US government is doing to stop China from making progress. This includes new rules that make it harder for Beijing to get these very advanced processors. Recently, the US government announced a set of export restrictions, making it much harder for China to get some of the most advanced microchips in the world. Even though these semiconductors are used in civilian technologies, the agency said that Beijing could use them to build advanced military systems. No wonder, since China is one of the leading innovators in the entire world.
And so what the bill does is to try to encourage the production facilities to be built in the United States so that we can diversify our sources of chips. Now, I think the whole issue here is that because of the geopolitical situation, these lawmakers are feeling very vulnerable that Taiwan's stability is in question, especially in the longer term.
Right now on Capitol Hill, legislation which has been several months in the making would set aside more than $50 billion in subsidies for chip makers in the US. As you can see there, they're still debating there.
Brian, the unlikely alliance between the Wall Street Journal editorial board and Bernie Sanders. Yes, both of them calling this bill corporate welfare, which is unusual to say the least. And then in the middle, there are those that say it unfairly favors just one company, that of course being Intel.
Was the inventor of many of those cutting technologies, including the chips. However, simply to politicize, now even weaponize the chips in invention, manufacture, and licensing is something that China highly rejects. Therefore, China's resolve is that, okay, we got to stand our own feet, and we factor much of the input to support the indigenous development of these chips.
Heavy restrictions were put in place by the Commerce Department. The country needs these materials to reach its long-term goal of modernizing its military. The biggest threat to the US would be a group of highly specialized militants with the most advanced weaponry the world has ever seen. So the president set things in motion. Export restrictions mean that companies like TSMC, which has started making its advanced semiconductors in Arizona, can't keep making these chips in China. A few days after the rules were made public, the US gave the company a 1-year waiver so that it could keep making semiconductors in Nanjing, China on one super specific condition. Since the new export limits affect advanced chips that China needs to develop AI, the company's China operations must continue to focus on making lower-end semiconductors. The country has been working hard to bring its military up to the same level as the US military by 2035. By making it hard for it to get access to advanced nodes or develop its capabilities, the US is well on its way to making sure that its rivals can't overtake them. Reports have shown that because of the ban, it would take China at least 10 years before they can make their high-end processors. They've got them there. In December, 22 Chinese companies were added to the list that can't export. On the same day, lawmakers in the US passed the fiscal 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. US defense contractors can no longer use Chinese semiconductors. With this law, they'll have to keep a closer eye on the subcontractors they hire. When he put the semiconductor clause in the military bill, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer claimed that the clause and the export restrictions would be a 1-2 punch. This is all being done to keep the US at the top. He went on to say that these two huge economies will have a big impact on the 21st century. He even claimed that the Chinese Communist Party has had a decades-long practice of cheating its way to the top by stealing American technologies and intellectual property. This has done a lot of damage to their national security and competitive edge in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, telecommunications, and and other major technologies. This law wasn't spearheaded by Biden, though. It was set in motion during Trump's time in office. During his tenure, things took a turn for the worst for the Asian country. Two Chinese companies that make microelectronics, Huawei and the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corps, weren't able to get US-made semiconductor equipment and software because of the government's export controls. The US isn't a big player in making semiconductors anymore, which is something the current president wants to change. However, American companies are still the best at designing these chips and exporting the equipment needed to make them. This gives the country a lot of power over the global supply chain for semiconductors. His export controls are much stricter than the ones put in place by Trump, and the world thought that the Orange Head was a power-hungry individual spearheading the American interest. They now require US microelectronics companies or foreign companies that use American technology to get licenses from the Commerce Department. That is, before they can sell Chinese companies the equipment they need to make the most advanced semiconductors, which doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. The rules also make it hard for Chinese microchip companies on the blacklist to hire Americans, and those who stay with these companies risk losing their citizenship if they do. So now, China can't make the semicomputers that are needed to make AI algorithms. That in turn makes it harder for their military to add advanced capabilities to their systems. So of course, this is a big setback for China. Without advancing their military, they can't compete with the US. This was a pretty smart move by the president of the US to ensure that they stay ahead of the game. He has effectively limited things for the other country. Without supercomputers, they can't design advanced weapons, simulate nuclear weapons, making advanced weather models, and other things like that. But at the same time, China already has the most powerful supercomputers in the world. The rules will also make it harder for them to make further advancements in the field of technology. A spokesperson for international peace has said that the export controls amount to a quasi-containment economic policy. Each year that passes, cutting-edge AI algorithms need more computing power and, as a result, more and more advanced chips. China will have bigger and bigger problems if the rest of the world moves ahead without it. But he's also skeptical about the immediate impact of the export controls on the country's defense industrial base because they wouldn't stop a possible Chinese attack on Taiwan in the next few years. China thinks of it as a province that broke away, and Beijing has said it will take it back by force if it has to. This kind of attack would use more traditional weapons, and they wouldn't need high-tech semiconductors for that. The threat of war between China and Taiwan would hurt American interests. If there was a war over the country in the next 5 or 10 years, the outcome of that war wouldn't depend on AI. It would depend on China's ability to land on water and China's political will. This is very old-fashioned stuff, but at the same time, it would affect the business sector of America as they get a lot of material exported from the country. The US can't interfere with this because it's inevitable, and they can't publicly declare war on another superpower that has nuclear weaponry. China already has a lot of the chips it needs and probably has some stored away. It will be able to do a lot of the same things with chips that are just a little bit below the threshold for export controls if it buys more of them. China doesn't have the infrastructure to mass produce the most advanced semiconductors at home, but it does make a lot of cheaper microchips, many of which are sent to the United States. So the tide could turn either way. This is all we have on Biden's microchip ban to curb China's AI weapons effort. See you in the next one.